I've spent 30 years reading the moods of the sea, learning her tempers and her silences, the way another man might learn the expressions on his wife's face. But I never learned my actual wife's face well enough, it seems, because when she left me last spring, I realized I'd been looking at the wrong horizon all along. The divorce papers came while I was 3 days out on a commercial run, delivered by email, like something you'd order off a menu. And when I finally made it back to port, the house we'd shared in Islamorada was already emptied of everything that mattered to her. She took the furniture, the photos, even the coffee maker, but she left the ocean. That was mine, she said. That had always been mine. So I did what any man does when the land offers him nothing but echoes and accusations. I went back to the water. Not as a job this time, not as a career, but as a kind of penance. A return to the only mother who'd never asked me to be anything other than careful and awake. The Florida Keys have a way of holding you even when you think you've left them behind. I grew up in these waters, a sunburned kid on my father's shrimping boat, back when the reefs were thick and the tourists fewer, and the whole world smelled like salt and diesel and possibility. My grandmother lived in a shotgun house near Stock Island, a Cuban woman who spoke more to the saints than to the living, and she filled my head with stories that had no place in the practical world of nets and navigation. She talked about things that lived in the deep places, about bargains made with the tide, about women who weren't women who sang in the spaces between waves. I'd forgotten most of it, the way you forget childhood prayers when adult life gets loud and demanding. But after the divorce, when I bought that old 32-foot sloop with the last of my savings and started anchoring out in the empty places where the charter boats don't go, those stories started coming back to me like driftwood returning to shore. I wasn't looking for anything supernatural. I was just looking for quiet, for a place where my failure as a husband couldn't follow me, where the only voice I had to answer to was my own. The ocean at night is a different country, one with its own laws and languages, and I'd been living as a citizen of that country for 2 months before it happened. I'd anchor in the shallows off Bahia Honda or drift in the channels, where the Gulf meets the Atlantic, and I'd sit in the cockpit with a lantern and a bottle of rum that I never finished, just watching the stars blur into the black water. Some men go to therapy. I went to the places where light ends and the world becomes mostly memory and motion. I told myself I was healing, that solitude was a kind of medicine, but really I was hiding, running from the parts of myself that the divorce had exposed like bones after a storm. The boat became my confessional, the waves my congregation, and every night I'd speak my regrets into the wind and hope they'd dissolve before morning. I thought I knew what loneliness looked like. I thought I'd mapped every depth of it, but I hadn't yet understood that some kinds of alone go down farther than any chart can measure, down to places where the human world stops and something older begins. What I'm about to tell you happened on a night when the air itself felt like a held breath, when the sea went so still it looked like black glass, and when I finally understood that my grandmother's warnings weren't just stories meant to frighten children into obedience. I'm telling you this now because I can't carry it alone anymore, because the weight of what I saw has changed the way I move through the world, and because there are some truths that refuse to stay buried beneath the surface. I don't expect you to believe me. I'm not sure I'd believe me either if I heard this from someone else's mouth, but I'm asking you to listen the way the ocean listens, without judgment, without interruption, just receiving what comes and holding it in the depths where strange things survive. It was late summer when the thing I can't explain found me, though the calendar meant nothing out there where time moved by tides instead of clocks. I'd anchored in a spot I'd never tried before, a shallow basin east of Big Pine, where the water goes from 15 feet to 5 in the space of a heartbeat, the kind of place that keeps the bigger boats away and leaves you alone with just the mangroves and the stars. The wind had died completely around sunset, which should have felt peaceful, but instead carried a tension I couldn't name, like the air before a thunderstorm that never arrives. The water had gone absolutely flat, transformed into something more like oil than ocean, and my boat sat so still on the surface that I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I'd made a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers that tasted like cardboard, and I was sitting in the cockpit with my old kerosene lantern hissing beside me, not reading, not drinking, just existing in that numb space I'd learned to inhabit since the divorce. Then the fog came, rolling in from nowhere the way it sometimes does in the Keys, thick and low and strangely luminous in the starlight, wrapping around the boat like something with intention. It swallowed the horizon first, then the mangrove islands, then everything beyond 20 feet, until my small sloop became the entire universe, floating in a cloud that smelled of salt and something else, something older, like wet stone and deep caves. I should have felt afraid, but instead I felt oddly calm, as if the fog had come specifically to give me the privacy I'd been seeking, to hide me even from the indifferent stars. That's when I saw the light beneath the boat, a pale blue-green glow that pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost biological, almost like breathing. And my first stupid thought was bioluminescent plankton, except I'd seen plenty of that in my years at sea, and this was different, more concentrated, more deliberate, moving in patterns that suggested purpose rather than drift. I stood up without deciding to, drawn to the starboard rail by something stronger than curiosity, and I held the lantern out over the water to see better, though the fog turned its light into a useless halo that barely penetrated 3 feet. The glow beneath intensified as if responding to my lantern, rising closer to the surface, and I could see now that it wasn't a diffuse cloud, but seemed to emanate from a single source, something large moving just below the visibility line. In water that should have been clear enough to see through, my hands were shaking. I remember that detail clearly, the way the lantern rattled softly against its metal handle, and my breath had gone shallow the way it does when your body knows something before your mind catches up. I'd been in storms that sent 40-foot waves over the bow. I'd had engine failures 50 miles offshore. I'd seen water spouts and shark frenzies, and once a whale breach so close it nearly capsized my vessel. But none of that had prepared me for the particular quality of dread that comes when the natural order reveals a crack, a seam, a place where the rules you've trusted start to bend. The glow shifted, moved aft toward the stern, and I followed it along the deck like a man hypnotized, my rational mind screaming that I should go below and lock the hatch, while some deeper instinct insisted I had to see, had to know, had to witness whatever was about to surface. The water began to move then, not with waves, but with displacement, something large, rising slowly from beneath, and the bioluminescence clung to it like foxfire, outlining a shape that my brain refused to process correctly because it was too familiar and too impossible at the same time. I heard myself breathing in short gasps, heard the blood rushing in my ears, heard the soft lap of water against the hull that sounded suddenly, like whispers in a language I'd never learned but somehow recognized. Then she broke the surface, and the world I'd known for 53 years quietly shattered like glass hit with the right frequency of sound. She came up slowly near the stern, maybe 10 feet from where I stood frozen against the rail, and the first thing I saw was her face, emerging from the black water with strings of seaweed draped across it like a veil. She was pale, luminously pale in a way that didn't seem possible for living flesh, and the glow I'd seen beneath the boat was coming from her skin itself, from patterns that traced along her shoulders and collarbones like the running lights on a ship designed by some ancient and alien intelligence. Her eyes found mine immediately, locked on with an intensity that felt physical, and they reflected the lantern light back at me in shades of silver and green that no human eye has ever held, the way a cat's eyes shine in headlights or the way deep-sea fish glow in the abyss. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare, as my mind tried desperately to categorize what I was seeing and failed with each attempt. She was human-shaped, yes, with a face that held a terrible beauty, high cheekbones and full lips, and a nose that seemed perfectly formed, but the proportions were subtly wrong, in ways I couldn't articulate, as if she'd been sculpted by someone who'd heard descriptions of humanity but never seen it directly. Her hair floated around her head in the water, long and dark and tangled with kelp and small shells and things that might have been pearls or might have been something else entirely. And as she tilted her head to study me, I saw that her neck had markings along the sides, slits or gills or scars, I couldn't tell which. She made no sound at first, just watched me with those impossible eyes while the water moved around her in gentle swells. And I realized with a shock that traveled down my spine like ice water that she was as startled by me as I was by her, that this was not a predator sizing up prey, but two beings from different worlds accidentally colliding in the fog. The moment stretched and bent, time becoming as strange as everything else, and I stood there holding my lantern like a talisman while she floated motionless in the dark water. And between us passed an understanding that had no words, a recognition that we were both impossibly and terrifyingly alone in our separate ways, both refugees in the spaces between the known and the forgotten. Then she opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not quite song and not quite speech, but something in between, a humming that seemed to vibrate in my chest and in the hull of the boat and in the water itself, a melody that felt older than language, older than civilization, older than anything I could name. It rose and fell with the rhythm of waves I couldn't see, and as it washed over me I felt something crack open in my chest, some sealed chamber where I'd locked away every loss and failure and moment of desperate isolation, and tears were running down my face before I even knew I was crying. She wasn't trying to enchant me or lure me or harm me. I understood that with sudden clarity she was simply speaking in the only language she had, and what she was saying was the same thing I'd been saying to the empty ocean for months, the same wordless grief, the same howl of loneliness that echoes in the spaces where connection used to live. My grandmother had been right about the women in the deep, but she'd been wrong about their danger, because this creature wasn't here to steal my soul, but to recognize it, to bear witness to the fact that I existed and suffered and sought meaning in the dark. And in that recognition I felt more seen than I'd been in all my years of marriage and work and purposeful practical living. She remained there in the water, suspended in that impossible stillness that defied every law of buoyancy I'd learned in 3 decades at sea, and I understood with creeping certainty that she was choosing to stay visible, that she could vanish in an instant if she wanted, but was deliberately holding herself in my lantern's weak sphere of light. Her arms moved slowly through the water, breaking the surface with barely a ripple, and I saw that they were longer than human arms should be, the proportions elegant but wrong, ending in hands that seemed delicate until I noticed the webbing between her fingers, translucent, membranes that caught the light like oiled silk. Those hands bore scars. I could see them clearly now, pale lines that crisscrossed her forearms and wrists in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like the ritual markings I'd seen in anthropology books about Pacific Island cultures. And I wondered, with a lurching sensation in my gut, what could scar a creature like this? What battles she'd fought in depths I'd never reach, what price she'd paid for survival in a world even more merciless than the one I knew. She raised one hand slowly toward the boat, not threatening but questioning, and I watched those webbed fingers extend as if she might touch the hull, and every instinct I had was screaming contradictions, telling me simultaneously to run and to reach back, to hide and to connect, to preserve my sanity and to abandon it entirely for the sake of this impossible moment. Her face held an expression I can only describe as yearning, a desperate curiosity that seemed to transcend species, and I realized she was trying to understand me with the same frantic intensity I was applying to her, to consciousness, groping across an evolutionary chasm that should have been unbridgeable. The humming sound changed, shifted into something more complex, and I heard variations in it now. different tones layered over each other, like the harmonic singing I'd once heard from Tibetan monks in a documentary, sounds that seemed to come from multiple throats at once, even though her lips barely moved. It resonated in my bones, in my teeth, in the wooden deck beneath my feet, and I felt, rather than heard, the questions embedded in that alien music, felt her asking who I was and why I floated here in her territory, and whether I meant harm or peace, or simply sought the same refuge she did in these forgotten waters between the known channels and the marked routes. My throat unlocked, and I found myself making sounds back to her. Nothing coherent, just vowels and half-formed words in English and Spanish mixed together, my voice cracking with emotion and sounding pathetically thin against her multi-layered song. But she stopped humming immediately when I began, her head tilting sharply in a gesture so bird-like and inhuman that my skin prickled with fresh awareness of her otherness. Her eyes widened, those reflective, impossible eyes that held colors I couldn't name, and she drifted closer to the boat by perhaps a foot, close enough now that I could see the individual water droplets on her face, catching the lantern light like diamonds, close enough that I could smell her, a scent of brine and minerals, and something organic and complex, like the smell of tide pools, when you put your face close to the trapped water and breathe in the concentrated essence of ocean life. I thought suddenly of my grandmother's stories, heard her voice as clearly as if she stood beside me on the deck, her Cuban accent thick with warning and wonder, as she told me about Las Sirenas, who appeared to sailors who'd lost their way, not lost in navigation, but lost in spirit, men who'd forgotten why they went to sea in the first place, and needed to remember that the ocean was not empty, but full of mysteries that demanded respect and humility. She'd told me they were neither evil nor good, but something else entirely, creatures of pure elemental power who existed in the spaces humans had abandoned, the wild places we'd mapped but never truly understood, and she'd warned me with absolute seriousness that if I ever met one, I should speak to it with the same prayer she used for the saints, because such beings were older than Christianity and remembered when the world was young and strange. I'd dismissed it as superstition then, the colourful folklore of an old woman who'd grown up in a different world, but standing there with this creature watching me with those ancient knowing eyes, I understood that my grandmother had been trying to prepare me for something real, something that existed in the margins of experience where science ended and mystery began. The Spanish prayers rose unbidden to my lips, words I hadn't spoken since childhood. Santa, Maria del Mar, protégeme de lo desconocido, and the creature's entire body reacted, a visible shudder running through her that sent ripples across the still water, and her expression transformed into something so heartbreakingly human that I felt my knees weaken and had to grip the rail to stay upright. She made a new sound then, softer than the humming, more vulnerable, a cry that held no melody but pure emotion, and I heard in it every goodbye I'd ever spoken, every loss I'd ever suffered, every moment I'd stood at a graveside or watched someone walk away for the last time, or felt the particular agony of love transforming into absence. Tears were streaming down my face again, hot and fast. And I was dimly aware that I was making sounds too, sobbing or laughing or both, overcome by a grief that wasn't entirely mine, but seemed to be shared between us, as if her sorrow and my sorrow had found each other across impossible distance and recognized themselves as the same essential wound. She moved closer still, her webbed hands reaching up to grasp the lowest part of my boat's stern, and I could see now that her fingers were tipped with something like nails, but harder, more like the material of shells, and the touch of those hands against my boat sent a vibration through the fiberglass that I felt in my bones, a connection as intimate as if she'd touched my skin. Directly, we stayed like that, locked in this strange communion, her holding my boat and me holding the rail, and both of us holding this moment that I knew even then would divide my life into before and after, and the fog pressed close around us like a congregation of witnesses, and the sea held its breath, and somewhere in the chemistry of my brain something fundamental shifted and would never quite shift back, leaving me forever changed in ways I'm still discovering even now. Her eyes held mine with an intensity that made looking away feel like betrayal, and I understood in that suspended moment that we were not predator and prey, or even simply observer and observed, but two beings who had each traveled through decades of isolation to arrive at this exact intersection of loneliness and recognition. The longer we maintained that connection, the more I could see past the alienness of her features to something deeper, a consciousness that flickered behind those reflective eyes with unmistakable intelligence and feeling, and I watched expressions cross her face that I could almost name, almost translate into human emotion, but not quite, like trying to remember a word in a language you spoke as a child, but have mostly forgotten. She blinked, and the movement was slow and deliberate, her eyelids closing from the sides rather than top to bottom, a reptilian gesture that should have repulsed me, but instead felt strangely intimate, as if she was showing me something vulnerable, some small truth about her nature that she rarely revealed. When her eyes opened again, they seemed different somehow, softer maybe, or perhaps it was just that I was learning to read them, developing a new literacy in this wordless language. We were building between us. Her grip on my boat loosened slightly and then tightened again, a rhythm I recognized after several repetitions as matching my own breathing, and I realized with a shock of wonder that she was synchronizing herself to me, matching her movements to my respiratory cycle as if trying to find common ground in our most basic biological functions. I found myself breathing more deliberately then, making my inhales and exhales longer and more measured, and she responded immediately, her own chest rising and falling beneath the waterline in perfect synchronization. And we established this strange meditation together, this shared rhythm that felt like the beginning of actual communication beyond language or sound. Her tangled hair floated around her face like a dark halo, and I could see now that it wasn't just seaweed woven through it, but other things too, small shells and bits of coral, and what looked like fishing line that had become so embedded it had practically grown into the strands, and each element told a story of years spent in these waters, of a life lived entirely in the medium that I only visited temporarily in my boats and diving equipment. The scars on her arms drew my attention again, those deliberate-looking patterns that caught the light as she moved, and I had the sudden irrational impulse to show her my own scars, the ones on my hands from years of handling lines and nets, the long white mark on my forearm from a fishing knife that slipped when I was 19, the evidence of my own survival written on my skin in a language she might understand better than any words I could speak. Without thinking too carefully about it, I released my grip on the rail and held out my hands to her, palms up, showing her the calluses and scars, and the wedding ring I still hadn't taken off despite the divorce being final for 8 months now, and her eyes fixed on my hands with absolute focus, studying them as if they were texts she was trying to decipher. She released the boat with one hand and raised it from the water, holding it suspended between us in the space above the surface, and I could see the water streaming from her webbed fingers and the way her arm trembled slightly, with what might have been effort or emotion, or both. For several heartbeats, we stayed frozen like that, my scarred hands and her scarred hand hovering in the fog-thick air, while the bioluminescence pulsed beneath us in rhythms that seemed to match our shared breathing, and the moment stretched and deepened until it felt almost unbearable, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. Then, moving with infinite slowness, she extended her hand closer to mine, not touching but approaching, and I could feel the coldness Radiating from her skin, could see the fine trembling that ran through her fingers, and I understood that this required as much courage from her as it did from me, that she was crossing her own boundaries and risking her own version of the unknown. When her fingertip finally made contact with my palm, barely grazing the skin, the sensation was electric and freezing simultaneously, and I gasped at the intensity of it, while she made a sound that might have been the equivalent of a gasp in her language. And in that instant of touch, I felt something pass between us. Not information exactly, but something more fundamental. A recognition that we were both creatures capable of wonder and fear, both marked by our worlds, both searching for connection in the vast loneliness of our separate existences. The sound of the distant boat horn shattered everything like a stone through glass, and her hand jerked away from mine as if burned, her whole body recoiling backward in a motion so fast I barely tracked it, and the intelligence in her eyes was suddenly replaced by pure animal panic that I recognized because I'd felt it myself countless times when danger approached without warning. She looked at me one last time, and in that final glance I saw something that looked like regret, or perhaps apology, an acknowledgement that this moment we'd built was ending before either of us wanted it. A two, and then she simply wasn't there anymore, gone beneath the black water with barely a splash, leaving only expanding rings on the surface and the phantom sensation of her cold touch still burning on my palm. I lunged for the rail and stared down into the depths, watching the bioluminescence swirl and fade, searching desperately for any sign of her in the darkness below. But the water had already closed over the place where she'd been, sealing the opening between our worlds as completely as if it had never existed. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my breathing had gone ragged and uncontrolled, breaking the rhythm we'd shared, and I felt the loss of that synchronization like a physical pain, like something vital had been severed. On the deck near my feet, catching the lantern light with an otherworldly gleam, lay a single scale the size of my thumbnail, opalescent and impossible, the only proof that I hadn't imagined everything, the only evidence that the barrier between mystery and reality had truly been breached tonight. I stood there trembling in the aftermath, the scale clutched in my fist, and that's when my grandmother's voice came flooding back with such clarity it was as if she were standing beside me on the deck, her papery hand on my shoulder, her tobacco smoke breath close to my ear as she whispered the warnings she'd given me. When I was barely old enough to understand words, she'd been dead for 15 years, but her stories had stayed alive in some locked chamber of my memory, and now they came tumbling out with urgent relevance. Those tales she'd tell during summer evenings on her porch in Little Havana, when the heat made the air shimmer and the boundary between. Belief and superstition felt thin as tissue paper. Las sirenas, she would say, making the sign of the cross over her chest with her crooked fingers. They come to men who are lost, to sailors whose hearts have been hollowed out by grief or loneliness or despair. And they offer something that looks like salvation, but is really just a different kind of drowning. She'd lean close then, her eyes going distant as if she were seeing something beyond the physical world, and she'd recite that old rhyme in Spanish, the one that had seemed like nonsense when I was young, but now rang through my head with prophetic weight. Los que escuchan su canción nunca vuelven a ser los mismos, porque una vez que conoces la profundidad, la superficie ya no es suficiente. Those who hear their song are never quite the same, because once you know the depths, the surface is no longer enough. And Jesus Christ, wasn't that exactly what had just happened? Hadn't I just been pulled into some profound deep that made everything else feel shallow and meaningless by comparison? I thought about my ex-wife's complaints during those final bitter months, how she'd accused me of being emotionally unavailable, of caring more about the ocean than about our marriage, of choosing isolation over intimacy, and hadn't she been right in ways I couldn't articulate even to myself? Hadn't I always felt more at home in the vastness of open water than in the confined spaces of domestic life? but what I'd just experienced with that creature had been intimate in ways that terrified me precisely because they bypassed all the defenses I'd built, all the emotional armor I'd welded around myself during decades of disappointment and loss. My grandmother had warned me about this specifically, I realized now, though I'd never understood what she meant until this moment. She'd said that Las Sirenas appear to men who have already begun drowning in their loneliness, that they're attracted to the particular frequency of human despair, like sharks to blood in the water, and they offer connection so pure and wordless that it makes all human relationships seem clumsy and insufficient afterward. She'd known men in Cuba who'd claimed to see them, she told me, fishermen who'd returned from encounters at sea, fundamentally changed, who'd spend the rest of their lives standing at the water's edge at twilight, waiting for something that would never come back. Their marriages crumbling, their friendships dissolving, everything terrestrial losing its flavor and meaning. I'd dismissed it all as superstition, the beautiful nonsense of an old woman whose mind had been shaped by poverty and limited education and the particular magical thinking of her generation. But standing there with impossible evidence in my hand and the phantom touch of webbed fingers still burning on my palm, I understood that she'd been trying to prepare me for something real, something that transcended the categories of myth and fact that I'd used to organize my rational adult world. The worst part was the memory of how she'd ended those stories, the warning she'd give after. The tales were finished, and the night had gone full dark around us. She'd say that the Serenas weren't evil exactly, that they didn't mean to destroy the men they encountered, but that they were creatures of such pure loneliness themselves that they couldn't help but recognize it in others, couldn't help but reach across the impossible divide, seeking connection. And the tragedy was that the connection they offered was too profound for humans to sustain while still living normal lives among normal people. They damn you with understanding, she'd say, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. They show you that you're not alone in your isolation, but the cost of that knowledge is that you can never be content with human company again because you've touched something older and truer and more honest than anything people can give each other. I'd thought she was being dramatic, indulging in the kind of fatalistic poetry that seemed built into her Cuban DNA, but now I wondered if she'd had her own encounter, if somewhere in her youth before she'd fled to Miami with the creature's approach came with a physical presence I hadn't anticipated, a displacement of water that made my small fishing boat rock with rhythmic gentleness, as if the ocean itself were breathing beneath me, and I gripped the rail with both hands while my heart hammered against my ribs like something trying to escape a cage. Her webbed fingers appeared first, sliding over the hull with a sound like wet silk on wood, each digit ending in what looked almost like translucent nails that caught the lantern light and refracted it into colors I couldn't name. Colors that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum my eyes were built to. In process, then came her face, rising above the waterline, closer now than before, close enough that I could see the intricate patterns of scales along her cheekbones that resembled nothing so much as ancient mosaic work, tessellations of pearl and silver that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as I watched. The grief that suddenly filled my chest wasn't mine, I realized with startling clarity. It was coming from her, radiating outward like sonar, like some form of emotional echolocation that bypassed my rational mind and struck directly at something primal in my nervous system. She opened her mouth, and the sound that emerged was simultaneously the most beautiful and most heartbreaking thing I'd ever heard, a vocalization that contained elements of whale song and human crying and something else entirely, something that made me think of cathedrals underwater and civilizations that had risen and fallen before humans learned to make fire. It was a sound of such profound mourning that tears sprang immediately to my eyes without my permission, and I found myself weeping for losses I couldn't name, for extinctions both personal and planetary, for every goodbye that had ever been spoken and every connection that had ever been severed by time or death or simple human failure. I understood then with sudden, devastating insight that she wasn't just some creature of folklore or biological anomaly waiting to be catalogued by science. She was a repository of memory itself, carrying within her the accumulated sorrow of centuries spent watching the world above the waves change and corrupt, and forget the sacred contract between land and sea. Her song contained specific griefs that I somehow recognized despite never having experienced them. The memory of cleaner waters and fuller seas, of coastlines unmarred by development, of a time when humans approached the ocean with reverence rather than entitlement, taking only what they needed and giving thanks for every fish that sustained them. I thought about the dying reefs I'd witnessed in my decades at sea, the floating islands of plastic I'd navigated around, the increasingly empty nets of commercial fishermen, the warming waters that drove familiar species into strange new territories or simply erased them from existence entirely. She was mourning all of it, I realized, carrying the weight of ecological catastrophe in her chest, like stones, and somehow she'd recognized in me not just loneliness, but guilt, the specific shame of being human in an era of unprecedented destruction, of being complicit through mere existence in the unraveling of systems older than civilization itself. Her eyes held mine with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously seen and judged, but the judgment wasn't cruel or angry. It was simply sad, infinitely sad, the way a parent might look at a child who's done something irreversibly harmful without understanding the consequences. I wanted to apologize, but didn't know how to begin, didn't know what language could possibly contain the magnitude of regret I suddenly felt, not just for my own failures, but for the collective failures of my entire species. Her webbed fingers tightened on the hull, and she pulled herself slightly higher in the water, close enough now that I could smell her. Not the fish rot stench I might have expected, but something ancient and mineral, like deep ocean vents and volcanic rock, and the particular scent of rain on limestone. The lantern light caught details I'd missed before. The way her tangled hair wasn't just woven with seaweed, but with other things too. Fragments of coral and fishing net and what looked horrifyingly like plastic bags. The detritus of human civilization incorporated into her body like a living indictment of everything we'd done wrong. There were scars everywhere on her exposed skin, not the random marks of predator encounters, but deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing, like someone had carved a story into her flesh, using an alphabet designed for water rather than air. I found myself leaning closer despite every survival instinct screaming at me to retreat, drawn by a compulsion that felt older than fear. And in that moment of proximity, I saw something in her expression shift, saw the alien intelligence behind those reflective eyes, recognized something in me that made her grief deepen impossibly further. She made another sound then, softer this time, almost questioning, and it occurred to me with shocking force that she was asking me something fundamental, posing a question that my grandmother's warnings had never prepared me for. Whether humans were capable of change, whether we could learn to remember what we'd forgotten, whether there was any hope at all for the reconciliation between her world and mine. The weight of being asked such a question by something so ancient and so damaged left me speechless and trembling, and I did the only thing I could think of. I reached into the pocket of my jacket with shaking hands and pulled out the small waterproof pouch where I kept my grandmother's rosary, the one she'd pressed into my palm on her deathbed, with instructions to carry it always on the water. I didn't know why I was showing it to this creature, didn't know what I was trying to communicate, but some instinct told me it mattered, that this small object representing generations of faith and protection and connection to something larger than the self might serve as a bridge across the impossible distance between us. She went utterly still when she saw it, her luminescent eyes fixing on the worn beads with an intensity that made the air between us feel charged with electricity. And then she did something that stopped my heart completely. She reached up with one webbed hand, moving slowly as if approaching something sacred, and touched the silver crucifix with one translucent fingertip. The moment of contact produced a sound like a bell ringing underwater, pure and resonant and somehow mournful. And I saw her expression transform into something I can only describe as recognition mixed with unbearable loss, as if the rosary had triggered a memory of her own, a connection to prayers and supplications that predated Christianity itself, to the universal human gesture of reaching toward the divine for comfort in an indifferent universe. She looked up at me then, with eyes full of terrible knowledge, and I understood that she'd answered her own question through my small gesture, that yes, humans carried within themselves the capacity for reverence and connection, but that we'd buried it under so much noise and greed and forgetfulness that it rarely surfaced anymore, and even when it did, it usually came too late to prevent the harm we'd already caused. The Spanish words came from somewhere deep and automatic, bypassing conscious thought entirely. "Abuela, ayúdame, no sé qué hacer." And the effect on the creature was immediate and devastating, her entire body convulsing as if I'd struck her physically rather than spoken a simple plea for help. She released the hull and sank beneath the surface so quickly I thought she'd fled entirely, my heart dropping with sick disappointment. But then she emerged again, even closer than before, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her face if I'd dared. Her expression had transformed completely, the alien otherness momentarily stripped away to reveal something raw and desperately human underneath. Grief so profound it seemed to bend the air around her like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. She was making small sounds now, not the haunting melody from before, but something broken and fragmented, like someone trying to remember how to speak a language they'd been forbidden to use for centuries. I found myself continuing in Spanish without planning it, words tumbling out in the Cubano dialect my grandmother had taught me, prayers and nursery rhymes, and fragments of the old songs she'd sung while mending nets on the porch of her tiny house in Matanzas. La sirena llora en la oscuridad, buscando almas que la puedan escuchar. And with each phrase, the creature's agitation grew, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow, her webbed hands reaching toward me with a desperation that bordered on panic. Something was breaking open between us, some ancient seal that had kept her world separate from mine, and I realized with mounting terror and wonder that she was trying to respond, that my grandmother's language had unlocked something in her that English couldn't touch. Her mouth moved in shapes that almost formed words, her throat working to produce sounds that approximated human speech. And though what emerged was distorted by vocal cords, designed for water rather than air, I heard syllables that resembled Spanish underneath the strange harmonics. Solo, recuerdo, olvidado, perdido. Words about remembering and forgetting and loss that came out fragmented but unmistakable. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the rosary, and I gripped it tighter while leaning over the rail far enough that a small, rational part of my mind screamed warnings about falling in, about being pulled under, about all the sailors' tales of men who got too close to things they shouldn't. But I couldn't stop myself from continuing, from asking her directly in my grandmother's tongue what she wanted, what she needed, why she'd chosen to reveal herself to a broken-down, divorced fisherman with nothing left but questions and regrets. Her luminescent eyes locked onto mine with such intensity I felt it like a physical pressure behind my sternum, and she raised one scarred arm from the water to point not at me, but past me, toward the distant lights of the shore barely visible through the fog, and then she pointed at her own chest, at the place where a human heart would be, and the gesture contained such obvious pain that I understood immediately. She was showing me the connection between her suffering and ours, between the dying ocean and the dying parts of ourselves we'd sacrificed in the name of progress and profit and the peculiar madness of modernity. The wind chose that moment to return, breaking the eerie stillness with a sudden gust that made the rigging sing and the lantern swing wildly on its hook, and the creature flinched backward at the sound with visible fear, her head whipping around to scan the darkness, as if the wind itself carried threats I couldn't perceive. I tried to speak again, to tell her to wait, to stay, that I needed to understand more, but the Spanish words stuck in my throat because I saw something in her posture that made my blood run cold. She was preparing to flee, gathering herself to dive deep and disappear forever, and I would lose this moment, this impossible connection, this chance to be entrusted with a truth that my grandmother had only hinted at in her stories. Desperation made me reckless, and I did something that shocked us both. I yanked the rosary from around my neck hard enough to break the chain and held it out over the water toward her, offering it with both hands like a covenant, like a promise I didn't fully understand but knew in my bones was sacred. Her eyes went wide with something that looked like shock or fear or perhaps holy terror, and for a breathless moment we existed in perfect suspension. Two creatures from incompatible worlds, stretched between the impossible space of a gift, offered and not yet accepted, while the wind grew stronger and the fog began to thin, and somewhere in the distance I heard the low mechanical groan of a boat horn cutting through the night like a blade through silk. She surged forward in one fluid motion that sent water sluicing over the deck and soaking my boots, and her webbed hand closed around the rosary with a grip that was surprisingly gentle despite the obvious strength in her fingers, but she didn't pull it away from me. Instead, she held it there between us, her hand touching mine through the sacred beads, and the sensation of her skin against my palm was like nothing I'd ever experienced, cool and smooth, but somehow electric, alive, with a current that seemed to flow both ways. For 3 heartbeats we stayed like that, connected by my grandmother's prayers made physical, and in those seconds I felt something pass between us that had no name in any human language. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or a benediction, or maybe just the simple recognition that loneliness transcends species, and that the need to be witnessed in our pain is universal, whether we breathe air or water. Then the boat horn sounded again, much closer this time, close enough that I could see running lights cutting through the fog, and her grip tightened convulsively on the rosary before she released it and my hand simultaneously, letting both fall as she dropped beneath the surface with barely a splash, leaving me stumbling backward with my grandmother's beads clutched against my chest and my heart racing like I'd just survived a heart attack or a religious conversion, or perhaps both at once. I stood there soaking wet and gasping like I'd been underwater myself, the rosary chain broken in my hands and the beads digging into my palms hard enough to leave marks that would last for days, while the approaching boat's horn blared again through the dissipating fog and the rational world came crashing back with all its demands and explanations and mundane certainties. The deck where she touched was still wet with seawater that caught the lantern light in strange prismatic patterns, and I dropped to my knees without thinking, running my hands over the planks as if I could somehow absorb proof through my fingertips, as if the wood itself might have recorded what had just transpired between a man and a myth made flesh. My hands found something solid near the starboard rail, something that hadn't been there before. And when I lifted it into the light, I nearly wept at the reality of it, a scale the size of my palm, oval and slightly curved, its surface shifting between pearl and silver and the deep blue-green of Caribbean shallows, depending on how the light struck it. I clutched it so tightly the edges cut into my skin, drawing a thin line of blood that seemed appropriate somehow. A small sacrifice to prove I hadn't imagined the whole impossible encounter, that my loneliness and grief hadn't conjured a hallucination detailed enough to leave physical evidence behind. The approaching boat resolved out of the fog, a sport fishing vessel probably heading back to Key West after a night charter, completely oblivious to the sacred ground they were violating with their diesel engines and electronic fish finders and casual dominion over waters they'd never truly understand. I shoved the scale deep into my jacket pocket and stood on shaking legs, waving them off with exaggerated gestures that I hoped communicated calm and capability rather than the barely controlled hysteria I actually felt coursing through my system like voltage. They slowed briefly, a spotlight sweeping across my boat in a cursory safety check, and someone shouted asking if I needed assistance, their voice carrying that particular blend of obligation and impatience that characterizes those who offer help they desperately hope won't be required. I shouted back that everything was fine, that I'd just been checking my nets, that I was heading in soon, each lie falling from my mouth with surprising ease, because the truth was impossible. Because saying, I just held hands with a mermaid who spoke broken Spanish and cried over the death of the ocean, would have resulted in Coast Guard intervention and psychiatric evaluation. They accepted my assurances with visible relief and motored away into what remained of the fog, their wake rocking my boat and erasing the last traces of disturbed water where she'd vanished, leaving me alone again, but fundamentally altered in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The silence that settled after their engine noise faded was different from the silence that had preceded the encounter, heavier somehow, more aware, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath and waiting to see what I would do with what I'd been shown. I pulled the scale from my pocket and held it under the lantern, turning it slowly and watching light play across its surface in patterns that seemed too complex to be mere biology. And I thought about my grandmother and her warnings and her songs and the way she'd always spoken about the sea as if it were a person rather than a place, conscious and grieving and desperately trying to communicate with those few humans still capable of listening. The scale was warm in my hand, despite having just come from cold water, and I realized it was warming to match my body temperature, adapting and alive in a way that made my marine biology degree feel like a collection of useful fictions we tell ourselves to avoid confronting deeper truths. I thought about my ex-wife and the arguments that had ended us, her frustration with my obsession with the ocean, her insistence that I loved the water more than I'd ever loved her, and the terrible thing was that I'd never been able to deny it convincingly because she was right. I'd always felt more at home in these depths than in any house or marriage or human connection. But what I had just experienced transcended even that lifelong devotion, had revealed that my relationship with the sea had been reciprocal in ways I'd never imagined, that perhaps the ocean had been waiting for me just as much as I'd been returning to it. I stayed out there until dawn, long after the fog lifted and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns and the temperature dropped enough to make my wet clothes uncomfortable, because going back to shore felt like a betrayal of something sacred, like walking away from a church service before the final blessing. The scale remained in my hand the entire time, and I found myself talking to the dark water in Spanish, using my grandmother's words to tell the disappeared creature things I'd never said to anyone, about the loneliness of living in a world that felt increasingly hostile to wonder, about the divorce and the drinking and the nights I'd considered just motoring out past the shipping lanes and letting the Gulf take me home in its own way, about the hollow feeling of being the last person in your family to remember the old stories and having no one to pass them to. I didn't expect answers and received none, but the act of speaking felt necessary somehow, like establishing the terms of a relationship that would define whatever remained of my life, whether she ever appeared again or not. When I finally started the engine as the eastern sky began to lighten, I looked back at the spot where she'd vanished one last time, and I swear I saw a brief flash of bioluminescence in the depths, a flicker of acknowledgement or farewell, or perhaps just plankton disturbed by current. but I chose to believe it was her, watching me leave, waiting to see if I would keep her secret or try to exploit it, the way humans exploit everything we touch. The weeks that followed the encounter became a study in dual existence, living simultaneously in the mundane world of dock work and diesel maintenance, while mentally inhabiting that liminal space where mythology intersects with lived experience, where the impossible leaves physical evidence that grows warmer in your pocket every time you touch it. I became a man, obsessed in the quietest possible way, spending my shore hours in the Key West Library's maritime section, pulling volumes on Caribbean folklore and pre-Columbian mythology that hadn't been checked out in decades, their pages brittle with age and sea-humid neglect. The librarian, a kind woman named Rosa, who reminded me painfully of my grandmother, began setting aside books for me without asking, seeming to understand that I was searching for something specific, even if I couldn't articulate exactly what. I read about the Taino water spirits called Atabe's daughters, about West African Mamiwata traditions carried across the Middle Passage, about Spanish sailor accounts from the 1500s, describing encounters with mujeres del mar that were dismissed as scurvy-induced hallucinations by their captains. Every culture that had touched these waters held stories of her kind, the details varying but the essence consistent, beings caught between elements, mourning the barrier between human and ocean, appearing to those who stood at similar thresholds of transformation or despair. I filled notebooks with sketches trying to capture her face, the exact configuration of her eyes, and the way her hair moved independent of current. But every attempt felt like a reduction, like trying to capture moonlight in a jar. I did what I swore I wouldn't do and reached out to marine biologists, framing my questions carefully around hypotheticals and folklore research rather than direct testimony, trying to gauge whether anyone in the scientific community would even entertain the possibility of undiscovered aquatic hominids in thoroughly mapped waters. Dr. Sarah Chen at the University of Miami listened patiently to my theoretical inquiries over a phone call I made from a bar payphone like I was arranging a drug deal, and her response was kind but devastating in its certainty. The biomechanics alone made it impossible, she explained, the energy requirements for maintaining human-level consciousness in cold water, the evolutionary path that would have had to diverge millions of years ago, the complete absence of skeletal evidence despite centuries of deep-sea fishing and modern sonar mapping. She recommended some excellent books on the psychology of maritime isolation and gently suggested that the mind, under stress, can create extraordinarily convincing experiences, especially for someone with recent trauma and a lifetime of ocean immersion, creating the perfect neural conditions for meaningful hallucination. I thanked her and hung up and pulled the scale from my pocket, holding it under the bar's neon light where it gleamed with that impossible iridescence. And I thought about how science is just another kind of story we tell ourselves, useful for building bridges and curing diseases, but utterly inadequate for explaining why this piece of her body pulsed with warmth, like a living heart. I didn't try contacting any more experts after that, recognizing that some experiences exist in territories that peer review cannot colonize, that demand faith rather than proof, acceptance rather than explanation. The insomnia that followed was profound and strangely welcome, because sleep felt like abandonment, like I might miss some crucial signal if I allowed myself to fully disconnect from consciousness. I took to anchoring in the same spot every night the weather allowed, cutting my engine at sunset and sitting in the dark with only a small lantern, the scale resting on the helm like a compass pointing toward invisible directions. I started bringing offerings without consciously deciding to, my grandmother's rosary that I'd repaired with fishing line, pieces of fruit that I'd lower into the water on string, a waterproof speaker playing the old Cuban songs she used to sing to me about the sea's daughters and their eternal longing. Nothing dramatic happened on these vigils, No repeat appearances or miraculous signs, just the normal night sounds of water against hull and fish breaking the surface and distant boat traffic, painting lights across the darkness. But I felt her presence anyway, or perhaps I'd simply learned to recognize that the ocean itself was alive in ways I'd professionally studied but never truly understood. Other fishermen began commenting on my strange routines, asking with that careful Keys politeness if I was doing okay, if maybe I needed to talk to someone. And I'd deflect with jokes about checking experimental fishing spots or gathering water samples for a friend's research, maintaining the protective layer of normalcy while privately undergoing a transformation that had no vocabulary in the world they inhabited. The clarity came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual settling, like sediment after a storm, finally revealing the water's true color. I understood that she had appeared not because I was special, but because I was finally broken open enough to see what had always been there, that my grandmother's warnings were never about creatures in the water, but about the water itself as a conscious entity that sometimes takes forms we can recognize in our loneliness and grief. The scale in my pocket was both absolutely real and utterly symbolic, physical proof of the encounter, and also a reminder that mystery doesn't require resolution, that some questions answer themselves simply by being asked with sufficient reverence. I stopped researching and started simply listening, spending hours with my hand trailing in the dark water, humming my grandmother's songs and feeling the ocean hum back through vibrations too low for ears, but perfectly pitched for whatever organ processes wonder. On my 63rd night of vigil, exactly 3 months after the encounter, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me with that heartbroken cry, that we were the same, both remnants of something dying, both witnesses to a world that no longer had room for the sacred, both desperately seeking connection across an abyss that grew wider every year as humans forgot how to speak the ocean's language, and the ocean forgot how to trust human intentions. I'm back, at the same coordinates tonight, 4 months to the day since I first saw her. The GPS numbers burned into my memory like a prayer I never consciously memorized. The scale sits in my shirt pocket against my heart, where I've carried it every single day since that night, and I swear it's grown warmer over time. Or maybe I've just learned to recognize a heat that was always there, the way you eventually notice your own heartbeat when everything else goes quiet enough. I'm not here expecting her return. I've moved beyond that kind of transaction, that bargaining mentality that says the universe owes us repeat performances of its miracles. Instead, I'm here because this spot has become my church, the only place where I can be fully honest about what I've become. A man who crossed some invisible threshold and can't pretend anymore that the world is only what we've measured and named and claimed to understand. The divorce that drove me back to these waters feels like it happened to someone else now, that desperate man fleeing failure and searching for the comfort of familiar tides. She didn't save me in any conventional sense, didn't offer wisdom or prophecy or magical solutions, but she cracked something open that needed breaking, showed me that loneliness is just another word for the space where transformation becomes possible if you're brave enough to stop filling it with noise. My grandmother died believing in things my generation learned to mock, and I spent 30 years at sea treating the ocean as a resource to be exploited, a workplace to be navigated, a force to be respected only in the practical sense of survival rather than reverence. But she knew something I'm only now beginning to grasp at 62 years, old with salt-damaged hands and a failed marriage, and nothing left to prove to anyone, that the world is alive in ways that science hasn't caught up to, that consciousness isn't some accident of human evolution, but a quality that permeates everything, especially the ancient waters that cover most of this planet we arrogantly named after the small portion we can walk on. The stories she told me weren't quaint folklore meant to frighten children into obedience. They were taxonomies of real encounters, accumulated wisdom about the other intelligences we share this world with, the ones who became invisible not because they ceased to exist, but because we stopped knowing how to look. I wish I could tell her that I finally understand, that her grandson who rolled his eyes at her warnings and her rosaries and her songs now carries his own strange relic and hums those same melodies to the dark water like incantations. I think she'd say she knew all along that I'd find my way back, that the ocean marks certain children from birth, and no amount of modern skepticism can fully erase that claim. The practical world still makes its demands. I still run charters for tourists and repair engines and pay dock fees and make awkward phone calls to my ex-wife about dividing what little we accumulated together, but I move through these obligations now as a kind of performance, playing the role of normal fisherman while privately knowing I've been irrevocably changed by something that has no name in the language of marinas and insurance forms. Some of the other captains have started avoiding me, sensing something different in the way I handle my boat or talk about the water, that slight edge of reverence that makes people uncomfortable when they're trying to maintain the fiction that we're in control out here. But a few, the older ones usually, the ones who've spent enough time alone at sea, pull me aside occasionally and share their own stories with the careful vulnerability of men unaccustomed to speaking about wonder. They describe lights that followed them for hours and patterns too deliberate for bioluminescence, voices carried on offshore winds that spoke in dead languages or no language at all, moments when the boundary between observer and ocean dissolved completely, and they felt themselves part of something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human categories. We don't form a club or share these stories publicly, but there's a subtle recognition now, a nod exchanged at the fuel dock that acknowledges we're part of an invisible fellowship of those who've seen beyond the veil and chosen not to pretend otherwise for the comfort of those who haven't. Tonight the water is calm, and the stars are obscured by high clouds that glow with reflected city light from the distant mainland, and I know she won't appear again because the gift was never about repetition, but about that single perfect moment of contact that proved what my grandmother always knew. I pull the scale from my pocket and hold it up to my lantern one more time, watching it catch the light with that impossible iridescence that no fish I've ever caught possesses. And I finally understand that proof isn't the point, that faith isn't about believing without evidence, but about recognizing that some evidence exists in registers our instruments can't detect, that require the heart's calibration rather than the mind's measurement. I slip it back against my chest and cut the lantern and sit in the darkness listening to the water speak in its ancient vocabulary of currents and depth and creatures moving in spaces humans will never occupy, and I feel something very close to peace for the first time since my marriage collapsed. The encounter didn't solve my problems or restore what I'd lost, but it gave me something more valuable. The absolute certainty that the world still holds mysteries that resist our conquest, that loneliness is just the price of admission to a larger belonging, and that somewhere in these depths swims a being who looked into my eyes and recognized a kindred spirit standing at the threshold between worlds. I'll keep coming back to this spot for the rest of my life, not seeking another encounter, but honoring the one I was given, carrying my strange talisman and my grandmother's songs and the knowledge that some questions answer themselves by teaching us to stop demanding answers and start living inside the mystery with gratitude and wonder. Have you ever felt the ocean was trying to tell you something you weren't ready to hear? Subscribe for more stories from the edge of the unexplained.